Welcome. You're here, and that is enough. Whatever the day placed on your shoulders, whatever noise has been circling in your chest since morning, whatever conversations replayed themselves on the drive home, whatever unfinished business sits like a stone at the bottom of your awareness, you can begin, right now, to set it gently down. There is no urgency here. There is no schedule to meet and no task waiting at the end of this. There is only this voice, soft and steady in the dark, and the slow, patient work of letting your body remember how to rest. So take one breath, deeper than usual. Feel your chest rise with the full weight of it. Then let the breath go all the way out, past the place where you think empty is, because there is always a little more room to release than you expect. Good. Again. And with the second exhale, let your shoulders drop. You did not know you were holding them up. You almost never do. Let them drop, and let the floor or the mattress take the weight of your spine, and let the voice carry you somewhere far from where the day left you. The night is long. The story is patient. And you are already closer to sleep than you were a moment ago. This story begins with silence. Not the gentle silence of early morning, when the darkness is still soft and the day has not yet declared its intentions. Not the comfortable silence of a room where someone you love is sleeping nearby. They're breathing a small and steady reassurance in the dark. This is a different silence. It has a different texture and a different weight. This is the silence that follows catastrophe. The silence of the held breath. The silence of a world that has lost half of itself and does not yet understand how to move through the space that loss has left behind. Imagine something very large removed from a room you have always known. The room does not immediately fill the space. The space remains, conspicuous and specific, shaped like the thing that was taken. That is the silence this story begins in, the silence of half the universe, held in the outline of what is missing. 5 years after Thanos closed his fist and half of all living things ceased to exist, Earth was still exhaling. Cities that had once moved at the urgent pace of overcrowded civilization now moved differently, slower, with gaps where the movement had been, the way a river moves when the tributaries that fed it have run dry and the main channel is wider than the water that fills it. There was parking in New York. There was seating in the subway cars. The grocery stores, which had always seemed designed for a population that could never quite fit inside them at the same time, now had aisles that could be navigated without the particular social negotiation of crowded spaces. None of these changes felt like improvements. They felt like symptoms, evidence of the subtraction that the numbers described but could not fully communicate. 3.8 billion people, and every other living thing in a proportion equivalent to half of everything that breathed. You're walking through one of those streets now. Let the image settle around you softly, the way a dream settles. Not sharp at the edges, not precise in its architecture, but true in its atmosphere. The light is low and amber, the particular light of late afternoon in a season turning cold, the sun already making its calculation that the day has been long enough and beginning to withdraw. Leaves have gathered against the curbs in drifts that have been there for weeks without being disturbed. A coffee shop keeps its lights on warm and yellow behind glass, and through the window you can see two people sitting across from each other without speaking, nursing drinks that went cold an hour ago, present with each other in the way that people are present when what they need is not conversation but the simple biological reassurance of another warm body in the same room. You understand this. You do not need to have lost anyone specific to understand this. Grief has a grammar that the body knows before the mind catches up. You have been in rooms like that. You have been one of those people. The street is quiet around the coffee shop's window. The leaves are undisturbed. The day is ending in the particular amber that makes everything look like a memory even as it is happening. This is the world the remaining Avengers moved through in those 5 years. Not as heroes. The category had become complicated. The mythology of extraordinary people doing extraordinary things sitting uneasily against the specific and concrete reality of the extraordinary loss they had failed to prevent. Bruce Banner, who was navigating a war inside his own biology that was older and in some ways stranger than the one they had all just lost. Natasha Romanoff, who had decided, with the characteristic decisiveness she brought to every choice, that showing up was the only thing available to her, and therefore the only thing she was going to do. Steve Rogers, who had found his way to a church basement and a set of folding chairs, and the specific discipline of listening to other people's grief without making it about his own. Clint Barton, who had gone somewhere none of them could reach him. James Rhodes, maintaining a military posting, and the professional composure that was his first language for everything, including loss. Thor, on a Norwegian coast. Tony Stark, at a lake, with a daughter named after a relative who'd been difficult and who was not difficult at all. Natasha kept the lights on at the compound. This phrase is both literal and metaphorical, and both meanings carry weight. The compound in upstate New York had been the operational center of the Avengers' work for years, a building designed for a team at full capacity, full of rooms and equipment and systems built for the assumption that many people would be using them regularly and that the work would continue. Natasha was not many people. She was one person, moving through the compound spaces with the purposeful efficiency of someone who has decided that occupying a space as though it matters is the most honest response to the fact that it does still matter, even if the team that once filled it is dispersed and diminished and moving through their separate griefs in their separate locations. She maintained a network of contacts that extended beyond Earth, because the snap had not been an event contained to Earth, and the ongoing work of monitoring what was happening in the wider cosmos required someone to be monitoring it. She took calls from Nebula, from the remaining leadership of Wakanda, from Carol Danvers when Carol Danvers was in range. She maintained a weekly check-in with whoever could be reached, not because the check-in had operational content, but because the practice of showing up for each other was the only thing she had to offer, and she was not going to stop offering it. She ate lunch alone at the kitchen table at a surface designed for 10 people, with the light coming in from the windows at the angle it always came, and the compound echoing slightly with the specific quality of a large space occupied by fewer people than it was built to hold. Steve Rogers ran support groups in a church basement in Lower Manhattan. A fluorescent room, folding chairs arranged in a circle, the smell of institutional coffee. The detail is worth sitting with because it represents such a specific choice, such a particular answer to the question of what to do with capability and history when the direct application of capability and history is not available. He could not fight what the snap had left behind. There was no enemy to address, no mission to undertake that would change the arithmetic of loss. What there was, instead, was this. A room with other people in it, people who were moving through the same geography of grief in their own specific ways, and who needed, more than almost anything else, to be seen in the moving. Steve listened. He spoke carefully and without performing his own authority, understanding that the point of the room was not him but the people in it. When the sessions ended, he walked through the city alone, through streets quieter than they should have been, a man who had survived 70 years of ice and emerged into a world that had moved without him, and then had done it again, taken something from under him while he was standing on it, and who had decided, with the same stubbornness that had always been the deepest thing in him, that continuing was what was required, and continuing was what he was going to do. And yet this is where the story begins. Not with action, not with strategy, not with the moment everything changed, but with this long and unglamorous and necessary period of aftermath. With the compound and its lights on, with the church basement and the folding chairs, with Thor on his Norwegian coast in a condition that had not yet been fully seen or named, with Clint Barton unreachable, with Tony Stark at a lake, doing the most radical thing available to him, which was to stay still and let himself be loved by the life he had built. These 5 years are the foundation of everything that came after. The grief that was lived in these years is the material from which the sacrifice was built. You cannot understand what they were willing to pay without understanding what the 5 years had taught them about the price of loss and about the specific kind of courage required not to give up when giving up would have been the most understandable choice available. Let that settle into you now. Let the amber light of the quiet street settle. Let the weight of the held breath become, slowly and gently, the weight of rest. You are safe. The story will take you the rest of the way. The geography of loss looks different from the inside than it does from the outside. From the outside, a city that has lost half its population might look, superficially, like a city at ease. Quieter traffic, shorter lines, more physical space for those who remain to occupy. From the inside, it looks like gaps, like the table at a restaurant with 3 settings instead of 6. Like the playground where the children who are there move differently, the way children move when there are not quite enough of them to sustain the particular physics of children's play, when the games that require a certain minimum number begin to thin and simplify. Like the apartment building where 3 floors of lights do not come on in the evening because the people who would have turned them on are not there to turn them on. The loss was legible everywhere, to anyone willing to read it, and the world had developed a specific literacy for the reading of it that was both necessary and exhausting, and entirely without alternative. There is a question that the support group in the church basement kept returning to, in different forms and different voices, and which Steve Rogers heard so often that he stopped needing to hear the words and simply recognized it by its quality, by the particular texture of the silence that preceded it. The question was, how do you grieve someone when there is no body, no grave, no physical location for the lost to inhabit? The 5 years had produced an entire generation of mourners who had nothing to bury, nothing to visit, nothing to stand in front of and say, "Here is where the lost lives. Here is where I come when I need to be near it." The grief had no address. It lived everywhere and nowhere, which is harder to navigate than grief that has a location. Steve did not have an answer. He said this. The saying of it, the honest acknowledgement that the question did not have an answer that could be given and received and filed and moved past, was, he had found, more useful than any answer would have been. What none of them said aloud, in those 5 years, what existed in the compound and the church basement and the Norwegian fishing village as a presence so consistent it had become almost comfortable, was hope. The particular hope that has been given up unconsciously, but that the body continues to maintain beneath the level of conscious decision, the way the body continues its biological functions regardless of the mind's opinions. They had stopped expecting to find a way, but some part of each of them had not stopped looking, in the way that searching continues in the background of a life organized around other things. It continued as the persistence of not quite giving up. It continued as the keeping of the compound's lights, as the weekly check-ins, as the support group in the church basement where the sessions ended, but the relationships continued. The hope without object that waited, in each of them, for an object to present itself. Stay with me. You're drifting now, slowly and safely, the way a boat drifts when the rope has been untied, and the current takes it without urgency, without destination, without the need to arrive anywhere by any particular time. Your breath is a little slower than it was when you began. Your hands are heavier against whatever surface holds them. The thoughts that were circling when you first lay down have grown less insistent, the way street sounds grow less insistent when a window is closed. Not gone, only reduced, only set a distance away from where you are. You do not have to manage them. You do not have to make anything happen. The voice is here. The story is here. And as you drift, let me tell you about a man who came back from somewhere that should have been impossible, and who brought with him the only idea that mattered. The storage facility was in San Francisco, in the part of the city that had always been slightly industrial, slightly provisional, the kind of neighborhood that accommodates the auxiliary functions of a larger story without being the story itself. Row upon row of units, corrugated metal doors and numbered locks, a landscape designed for the temporary custody of things that have become inconvenient to keep at home. The van was in Unit 616. It had been catalogued by the city system for processing the estates of the snap's victims. A massive and ultimately impossible task, given the scale of what had been taken, given the 10,000 ways that property and ownership and custody became legally ambiguous when half the population of a city vanished simultaneously. The city had done what it could. The van had been assigned a number, a shelf, a record entry. It had been sitting in the dark for 5 years, which is nothing to a van, but which was, in the larger accounting, a very long time for the most important machine on Earth to be sitting idle. The quantum tunnel inside the van had been built by Janet Van Dyne, whose understanding of the quantum realm exceeded anyone else's on the surface world by virtue of having spent 30 years inside it. It had been refined by Hope Van Dyne, who had her mother's precision and her own considerable additional decades of study. Scott Lang had learned to operate it the way non-specialists learn to operate technology they did not build and do not fully understand, through accumulated experience, through the specific knowledge of what it felt like when the thing was working correctly versus when it was not, through the relationship between a body and a machine that develops over time into something that functions without requiring conscious mediation. He trusted the tunnel. The tunnel had taken him to places that had no analogue in the surface world and returned him reliably. He trusted it the way you trust a tool that has not failed you yet. He emerged from the quantum space in the van in the storage facility and immediately understood that something was wrong with the time. Not with the quantum transit itself. The transit had functioned normally, had deposited him where and when it was supposed to. What was wrong was the correspondence between the time he had spent inside the quantum space and the time that had passed outside it. He had been inside for what his body registered as a few hours. The world outside the van was insisting that 5 years had elapsed. He sat in the van for a while with this information and tried to determine what to do with it. The storage facility was quiet around him. The city outside was quieter than it should have been. The specific texture of 5 years of loss was audible in the quality of the afternoon air. He drove through San Francisco carefully, reading the evidence, the memorial walls, the reduced traffic, the way a city that had been designed for one population was operating at a different capacity. Not broken, not dysfunctional, but adjusted, calibrated around an absence rather than a presence, the way a river adjusts its course around a removed obstruction. He understood, by the time he reached the address he was looking for, the general shape of what had happened. He did not need the details to understand the general shape. The general shape was everything he had known was 5 years older, and everything he loved was either gone or transformed by the 5 years into something he had not witnessed. He rang the doorbell of the house where his daughter lived with her mother. He did not know, until the door opened, which list her name was on. Cassie opened the door. She was taller. She was a teenager where she'd been a child. She was alive. The relief that moved through Scott Lang in that moment was the kind that arrives in the body before the mind has finished constructing the full argument for it. Physical, immediate, total. He held her, and she held him back with the full-arm certainty of a teenager who is not too old to hold on completely when holding on is what the moment requires. And neither of them spoke for a while because speaking would have required choosing words, and the words available were not adequate to the event. She was alive. That was the entire fact. Everything else was the kind of detail that could wait. The quantum realm had given him something else, alongside the 5 hours that had been 5 years. It had given him a question, not a fully formed theory. Scott was not a theoretical physicist and had never claimed to be, and the thing he was carrying was not yet a theory, only a perception, the kind of immediate understanding that arrives in people who have experienced something directly, without the interference of prior frameworks. Time had behaved differently in the quantum space. Duration had been elastic. What took 5 years on the surface had taken hours in the quantum medium. If time was elastic in the quantum space, if the relationship between past and present was not a fixed line with an arrow, but something more like a landscape, something you could potentially navigate in more than one direction, then perhaps the past was not closed. Perhaps the loss that had been accepted as permanent was not. He was not a physicist. He did not know how to say this in the language that physicists speak to each other, but he knew what he had experienced, and he knew that what he had experienced implied something, and he drove to the Avengers compound because the people there would know whether the something was real. Natasha and Steve were in the compound together when he arrived. He did not call ahead because calling ahead felt like giving himself time to be talked out of the reason for the call, and he did not want to be talked out of it. He found them in the kitchen, which was the room in the compound where the remaining occupants spent the most time. The room with the warmth of the stove and the coffee maker, and the window that looked out over the compound's grounds toward the tree line. He sat down and he told them what he thought the quantum realm might make possible. He used the phrase time heist, which had the quality of a phrase invented on the spot by someone who needed a name for a concept before the concept was fully formed, a placeholder that became the actual name because it captured something true about the nature of what was being proposed. Natasha and Steve listened to him with the specific quality of people who've been waiting for something they couldn't name and are now hearing it named. The room was quiet. The coffee maker finished its cycle. Outside the window, the trees were the particular grey-green of a late autumn, the light already beginning its early exit. The most important conversation that had happened in 5 years had just ended. Now they needed Tony Stark. Scott Lang had a quality that made him effective in situations that the people around him were better educated and more capable than he was, and that quality was the willingness to state the obvious thing directly without protecting himself from the possibility that the obvious thing might be wrong. He had walked into the compound with an idea that he could not fully justify theoretically, which he knew, and he had stated it anyway, which a more technically qualified person might not have done. might have spent the intervening time doing the literature review, establishing the theoretical foundation, preparing the argument against the objections he could anticipate. Scott did not do any of that. He said what he thought and waited to see what happened. And what happened was that two of the most capable people on Earth looked at each other with the expression of people who have just been told something that reorganizes everything they thought they knew about the available options. That expression was worth the drive. The quantum realm had been named by scientists who were trying to describe a dimension they did not fully understand with the vocabulary they had available, which is the situation that produces the most interesting names. Names that capture something true about the experience of a thing without having the full theoretical framework to explain the truth they have captured. Quantum referred to the behavior of matter at subatomic scales, where the normal rules of physics give way to a different set of rules that are just as rigorous but considerably stranger and less intuitive. Realm referred to the fact that the tunnel opened into something that felt from the inside like a place rather than a state, a place with its own particular sensory qualities, its own textures of light and movement, and the specific disorientation of a spatial geometry that does not map cleanly onto the 3 dimensions of the surface world. What Scott knew about it was direct knowledge, the knowledge of a body that has been there, and that knowledge had a quality of certainty that theoretical understanding sometimes cannot match. Steve had been the one, in those early hours after Scott's visit, to say out loud what both he and Natasha were already thinking, that the idea was worth pursuing regardless of whether they could make it work themselves, because the alternative was not pursuing it, and not pursuing it was not an option they were prepared to accept. He said it quietly and without drama, which was how Steve Rogers said most of the things that carried the most weight. Natasha agreed with a single nod, which was how Natasha Romanoff responded to the statements that she had already arrived at independently, and which required only acknowledgement rather than discussion. They'd been a 2-person operation for 5 years. They had maintained the compound and its network and its function on the assumption that doing the work with insufficient personnel was better than not doing the work. Now there was a direction to point in. That changed the texture of everything. The compound in those early hours after Scott Lang's departure carried a changed atmosphere. Natasha had already begun pulling up the files she'd maintained on Hank Pym's research, the publicly available portions of it, the theoretical papers that had been circling in academic physics for years without generating the kind of attention they deserved, partly because they required a conceptual leap that most physicists were not prepared to make, and partly because Hank Pym had spent a significant portion of his career actively discouraging anyone from following his research too closely. She understood the quantum realm at the level of someone who's read everything available and spoken to the people who have been there. Steve sat across from her and let her talk, asking occasional questions that were less about the content and more about the confidence. How sure was she? How much of this was plausible versus possible versus wishful thinking? She said, "It is the most plausible thing anyone has brought to this table in 5 years." He said, "Then let us go find Tony." "Your breath is slower now. That is not something you are doing. It is something that is happening to you. The way sleep always happens rather than being achieved, arriving in its own time when you have stopped reaching for it. Let that continue without interference. Let your chest rise and fall with the patient automatic rhythm of a body that knows how to rest even when the mind is still keeping company with the story. The room is quiet, or if it is not entirely quiet, the sounds in it are the sounds of the world going on without needing anything from you, and you can let them exist in the background without letting them claim your attention, you are warm, you are held. And the next chapter of the story is about a man who had found, at enormous cost, a version of peace, and who was about to discover that peace was not the same as finished. There is a particular kind of grief that does not present itself as grief. It looks from the outside like rest, like a man who rises before dawn not because he cannot sleep, but because the morning has something specific to offer him that the rest of the day does not. The mist off the water, the way the trees announce themselves before the light is fully committed to being light, the sound of a dock shifting slightly in a stillness that exists only in that hour. Tony Stark had built, in the 5 years since the snap, something that looked like the life he had always said he wanted. Quiet, deliberate, organized around what was real and immediate and held. A cabin by a lake in upstate New York. A woman he loved who had chosen to stay. A daughter who was 3 years old and who navigated the world with a fearlessness that seemed to have come from neither of her parents, and which he suspected she had simply invented for herself because it was the most efficient available approach. Morgan called him Mommy's daddy. She had devised this designation independently early and had stuck with it with the persistence of a small person who has named something correctly and sees no reason to change. He had tried, on several occasions in the first year, to offer alternatives. Dad, Daddy, Stark, any of the standard options available in the parenting vocabulary. She had received these suggestions with the polite patience of someone who is confident in their own system and finds the proposed alternatives interesting but ultimately insufficient. Mommy's daddy. The phrase had become, for Tony, the most accurate description of what he was and what he wanted to remain. The specific person who belonged to this specific family, whose worth was measured not in scale or consequence or the architecture of history, but in the weight of a 3-year-old's arms around his neck. Underneath all of this, very quiet and very persistent, was the problem. Not Morgan, not the lake, not the life. The problem that had been there since the day in the ruined landscape of an alien planet when he had held a boy named Peter Parker and felt him go. Half the universe. 3.8 billion people on Earth alone. Thanos' arithmetic, applied without mercy or precision, or the slightest acknowledgement of what the numbers meant in terms of individual lives and individual losses. Tony Stark's mind, which had always been the thing he trusted most, and the thing he was most unable to quiet, did not know how to leave a problem of that magnitude alone. He had tried stacking the cabin and the lake and Morgan between himself and the problem, and the stacking worked reasonably well in the daytime hours, and in the nights when it didn't work, he went to his workshop and built things and tried not to think about the thing he was not thinking about. When Steve and Natasha drove to the lake, which they did without calling ahead, which Tony had also been expecting in the specific way that you expect things you've been trying not to think about, he met them on the dock. He was carrying a coffee mug. He was wearing the clothes of someone who had not been thinking about visitors. He listened to Scott Lang's theory about the quantum realm, relayed by two people who understood it well enough to describe its shape, but not its engineering. And he followed the theory with perfect precision in the first minute, and spent the rest of the explanation thinking 6 steps beyond where the explanation had reached. He asked questions. He was polite. He was warm in the way that Tony Stark was always warm with the people he loved, which was not demonstrative warmth, but attentive warmth. The warmth of someone who is genuinely present with you, which is a rarer form of warmth than the performative kind. Then he said no. His no was not a wall. It was not delivered with anger or with the cold efficiency of someone who has decided the world is not their concern anymore. It was more painful than either of those because it was the no of a person who understands the stakes completely and has run the calculation honestly and arrived at a result that differs from the one everyone else in the room wants. He had failed before. He'd been as prepared as any human being had ever been for a confrontation at the scale of a Thanos, and he had still failed, and the cost of the failure was specific and physical, and had a name and a face and had said one word: "I don't feel so good." Before dissolving in his arms, he had a daughter now. He had a lake and a life that was real, and that required him to be present and alive in order to continue being real. He was not going to put the reaching for the impossible ahead of the having of the possible. Not again. Not when the impossible had already taken everything once before. Steve drove back. The road was long and quiet, and neither of them talked much because neither of them had found the language yet for what had just happened. A refusal that was completely understandable and completely unacceptable. A choice that was entirely Tony's to make and that would, if left unchanged, mean the half of the universe stayed lost. Steve had run these calculations before, in a different form, had been the person who chose, and the person who couldn't make someone else choose, and had lived with both. He understood Tony. He did not attempt to argue with what he understood. He drove back to the compound and told Natasha, and then he went to the gym and did the thing Steve Rogers does when he needs to be somewhere that doesn't require him to manage the emotional cost of clarity. Tony went back inside, made dinner, read to Morgan from a book about robots, which she had decided were her particular subject, and which required him to perform all the robot voices with appropriate mechanical register, which he did because she required it, and because the performance of robot voices at 7 p.m. while the lake turned dark outside the window was the most grounding available experience in the taxonomy of his life. He put her to bed. He sat outside in the dark for a while and looked at the water. Then he went to the workshop because he was Tony Stark, and Tony Stark cannot look away from an interesting problem. And the problem of whether time travel through the quantum realm was theoretically possible was the most interesting problem he'd ever encountered, and had been circling in his mind since Scott Lang's words had landed in it at the dock that morning. He worked through the night. He made mistakes. He corrected mistakes. He made more progress. And somewhere very early in the morning, while the lake outside reflected stars, Tony Stark solved time travel. He sat with the solution for a long moment. Then he picked up the phone, called Pepper, and in the morning drove to the compound and told them he was in. Pepper Potts had known, for the entire 5 years of the lake and the cabin and Morgan's growing up, that Tony had not finished. She knew him with the specific completeness that comes from having been in close proximity to someone through everything they were capable of being, through the performance and the damage and the love that lived underneath both. And what she knew was that the solved problems always called him back. Not because he was incapable of peace. He was more capable of it than he had ever been. But peace, for Tony Stark, was not the same as stopping. Peace was having chosen. The ongoing daily project of choosing the lake and choosing Morgan and choosing the quiet was something he was genuinely committed to, and the commitment was real. It was also something that existed alongside the other thing, the mind that did not know how to close a file it had opened, the intelligence that moved through the problems of the world whether or not he gave it permission to. The morning after Natasha and Steve's visit, Tony woke before Morgan and sat on the dock in the specific quality of light that exists between 4 and 5 in the morning in late autumn, the darkness thinning slightly, the water carrying the reflection of stars that are beginning to lose their competition with the approaching day, the cold having the particular sharpness of cold that feels like clarity rather than discomfort when you are outside by choice. He had been thinking since he went to bed, which was the thing his mind did when it had been given a problem and had been told to leave the problem alone, which was to say it had not left the problem alone at all, but had simply conducted the process at a quieter register. He thought about the 5 hours that had been 5 years for Scott Lang. He thought about what that asymmetry implied. By the time the light had fully arrived, he had several lines of approach, and one that was clearly more promising than the others. The solution came in the early hours of the morning in the workshop with the cold coffee and the quiet lake. He'd been wrong about his own wrong, had been making an assumption about the quantum realm's temporal behaviour that was limiting the theoretical model to a narrower set of possibilities than the system actually possessed. When he released the assumption and let the mathematics run without it, the solution did not arrive dramatically but quietly, the way true solutions arrive, not as a flash but as a settling, a sense of the problem's actual shape becoming visible, as if the light had changed and the shape had always been there. He checked it. He checked it again. He went to stand in the doorway of Morgan's room and watch her sleep for a while, because he needed to hold the two things simultaneously, the solution in his head and the specific weight of what the solution was going to ask of him, before he made the call to Pepper that would begin the process of choosing. The condition Tony gave them was not stated as a condition. He did not present it as a negotiation, or as leverage, or as the price of his participation. He presented it as a fact about the situation that he needed acknowledged before he could take the next step. Whatever happened, Morgan would be okay. The specific contours of what okay meant were implicit and understood by everyone present. If the plan worked, okay was straightforward. If the plan did not work, if Tony did not come back from wherever the plan took him, okay meant Pepper and the lake and the life at the cabin continuing without its centre. He had thought about this. He had thought about it with the same precision he brought to engineering tolerances and material specifications and all the other careful accountings his work required. The math came out the same way every time. Some prices are worth paying. The distinction was the only question that mattered, and he had already answered it. You're going deeper, not falling, drifting. The distinction matters in the way that all the softer distinctions matter when the mind is releasing its grip on precision. Falling implies urgency and the anticipation of impact. Drifting is what happens when you stop navigating and let the current do its work, when you give yourself over to the movement without needing to know the destination. Your arms are heavy, your jaw is loosened. Your thoughts, if they're still moving at all, are moving the way clouds move on a windless day, slowly, without direction, without urgency. The voice you are hearing is growing less like something external and more like something that was already in you, a quiet current you're only now noticing. Let it carry you. There is nowhere else to be. The compound became, in the weeks after Tony's return, something it had not been in 5 years, a place where work was happening. Real work, the kind that changes the temperature of a room. The specific mixture of concentration and momentum, and the intimate electricity of people who are building something together that none of them could build alone. Tony had his solution, and the solution was correct in the mathematical sense, which is to say that it described a path without certifying that the path was walkable. The gap between a correct equation and a functioning time machine is where most of physics lives, and closing that gap is not a matter of intelligence alone, but of the particular combination of intelligence and labour and iteration and failure. that Tony Stark had been performing at the outer edge of human capability his entire working life. The workshop filled with components, screens lit up. The compound remembered what it had been built for. Bruce Banner arrived with the specific quality of a man who'd been waiting to be useful again. He had spent the 5 years since the snap doing something that, from the outside, looked like a strange kind of self-help project, but which was, from the inside, the most significant personal achievement of his life. He had reconciled himself with the Hulk, not defeated him, not suppressed him, not learned to manage him the way you manage a chronic condition. Reconciled. The two beings who had been at war inside one body, the mild physicist and the green disaster of rage and power, had arrived at something like an agreement, and the result was a man who was large and green and gamma-irradiated and calmer than he had been in years. He was, he told Tony, the best of both of them. The intelligence and the strength, the precision and the power. There was a lightness to him that had not been there before, the particular lightness of someone who has made peace with the most difficult thing in their life, and found that the making of peace was possible. His contribution to the project was twofold. First, he had the scientific framework to extend Tony's mathematics into the biological dimension, to model what the quantum realm's temporal field would do to a human nervous system during transit, to calculate the tolerances and the risks and the specific parameters outside of which the trip would not be survivable. Second, and more immediately, he understood what the Infinity Stones would do to whoever attempted to wield all 6 of them simultaneously. The gamma radiation from the combined stones, he explained to the group in the compound's meeting space, would be sufficient to kill a normal human being before they could complete the necessary action. This was not a hypothetical concern. It was a medical fact about a specific physiological process and its effects on a specific category of tissue. He said it calmly and without drama, because Bruce Banner in this configuration had developed the ability to discuss very large catastrophic facts with the equanimity of someone who has already processed the fact before the meeting began. James Rhodes came because James Rhodes always came. This is one of the clearest and most consistent facts in the entire surrounding history of Tony Stark. Rhodey shows up. He'd shown up in the Mojave Desert when Tony was testing the Mark II and needed a witness. He'd shown up in Monaco when things went sideways with a pace that outran the available preparation. He had shown up at every inflection point in a friendship that had been tested by conflict and secrecy, and the specific difficulty of loving someone who treats self-destruction as a design philosophy. He came to the compound with the soldiers' understanding of what they were planning, which is the understanding that strips away sentiment and abstract heroism and keeps only the operational essentials: objective, team, variables, exit. He was also one of the most experienced combat veterans in the room, which was going to matter. Bringing Clint Barton back required something different from a phone call. Natasha went to find him in the place he had gone after losing his family, which is a sentence that describes a geography without naming it, because the specific geography of where Clint had gone was less important than the quality of the place. Dark, cold, purposeful, in the way that grief becomes purposeful when the person experiencing it has decided to turn it outward rather than inward, to make it useful in the only way they know how, which in Clint Barton's case meant skills that had always existed in him, alongside the father and husband and the archery and the farm, skills that had been dormant for a long time before they were needed again. Natasha found him doing work she did not approve of and understood completely, because she had done the same work once in a different life, for different reasons. She did not lecture him. She did not offer him absolution. She sat with him in the specific quality of darkness he had built around himself, and she told him what Scott Lang had told her about the quantum realm, and she said the names of his children, and he came. The first test of the time machine happened in the compound's loading bay, on a grey morning when the light was thin and flat and the air smelled of metal and old concrete. The machine itself was built into the structure of a modified vehicle, a deliberately unimpressive container for what was, if Tony's mathematics were correct, the most significant technological achievement in human history. The test subject was Scott Lang, who had the most direct experiential relationship with the quantum realm and also the quality of cheerful willingness to go first through any door that makes him genuinely invaluable in situations requiring exactly that quality. He stood on the platform and gave a thumbs up to the assembled group and disappeared into the quantum space. He came back as a child, then he came back as an elderly man, then he came back at his correct age, looking slightly bewildered but otherwise intact, and through all of this maintained a commitment to real-time verbal reporting that was both extremely useful for diagnostic purposes and extremely distressing for everyone watching. Bruce calibrated the control systems through the night and into the next morning, working with the steady focus of someone who has found the problem interesting enough to sustain his attention through the hours when the interesting fades and what remains is only the work. He adjusted the temporal field parameters, recalculated the transit duration relative to surface time, and ran the equations until the precision was reliable enough to target a specific moment rather than a specific era. There was something worth noticing in this process, the way that what had been a crisis became, through patient methodical attention, a solved problem. The world-saving acts in this story are not the dramatic ones, they are the patient ones. Someone staying up all night with a control panel, someone reading through equations until the error declares itself, someone who keeps trying because the alternative is not trying, and not trying is not available to them. When the second test went correctly, Scott went back, Scott came back, Scott was the right age in both directions. They understood that the machine was ready, the past was accessible. All that remained was to decide where to go. The suits Tony designed for the team's use in the quantum realm transit were different from anything he had previously built, because the requirement was different from anything he had previously addressed. A suit built for combat exists in the present, in a fixed and knowable physics, against opponents whose capabilities can be assessed and modelled. A suit built for time travel through a quantum medium exists in a relationship with the physics of causality that requires a different kind of engineering, not the engineering of force and response, but the engineering of interface, the engineering of a boundary between a human body and a dimension that experiences time as a negotiable quantity rather than a fixed one. Each suit was calibrated to the individual, because the quantum realm's interaction with human biology is not a uniform process but a specific one, shaped by the particular characteristics of the individual's physiology and the specific way their body has historically responded to extremity. Tony had data on all of them. He used all of it. The planning sessions in the compound's main space had a quality different from any planning session any of them had been part of before, because the nature of the plan was different in kind from any previous operation. Every other mission they had undertaken had been anchored in the present, a location that existed in the now, accessible through conventional means, defensible by reference to the fixed physics of a shared reality. This mission was anchored in the past, in locations that existed only in the sense that they had existed, in the specific and irreversible sense that things that have happened cannot unhappen but can be revisited if you have the right vehicle. The planning required a different relationship with contingency, not the contingency of an enemy who might or might not deploy a specific weapon, but the contingency of history, the fact that the past is populated by people and events that will behave as they actually behaved regardless of the future's wishes. Nebula's role in the planning was both operational and, in ways none of them fully anticipated at the time, the pivot on which the entire subsequent catastrophe would turn. She was going with Rhodey to 2014 Morag to retrieve the Power Stone before Thanos' forces had assembled around it. A clean in-and-out extraction that matched her particular skills and her knowledge of the period and the location. She accepted the assignment with the flat pragmatism she brought to everything, the efficiency of a being who has operated at the edges of the worst things in the universe for long enough that the categorical difference between this and any other difficult assignment had been absorbed into the wider category of difficult assignments. She did not express enthusiasm or reluctance, she simply prepared. What none of them knew was that her neural network, which was partly cybernetic, was capable of resonating with its own past version when they occupied the same temporal proximity, and that the 2014 nebula would be able to access what the 2023 nebula carried in her memory. Thor's return to the operational briefing after his conversation with Frigga had a different quality from his arrival at the compound days earlier. The change was not dramatic. He was still Thor, still carrying everything that the year since Asgard fell had placed in him. But the specific weight that had been making him smaller than he was, the weight of failure treated as verdict rather than as circumstance, was different now. He had not put it down. He had revised it, placed it in the category of things that are real and must be carried rather than the category of things that define the carrier. He stood in the compound's main space with Stormbreaker and something approaching his full presence, and when Tony looked at him across the room, it was the look of one person assessing whether another person is available for what is about to be asked of them. He was available. They both knew it. Let the weight of your body continue to deepen. Your legs are heavy. Your shoulders are heavy. Your hands are resting against whatever surface holds them with the loose completeness of hands that have stopped holding on. The thoughts moving through your mind are slower now, like river water approaching the place where the current eases and the channel widens and the river stops hurrying. If you drift away from the words, if the voice begins to recede and something softer and darker takes its place, let that happen. The story will still be here if you return, and if you do not return, if sleep has already claimed you in the way it claims people who have been patient enough with themselves to let it arrive, then that is the right place to be, and you should go there without guilt. Rest is not a failure of attention. Rest is the destination. The briefing happened in the compound's main space, around a table that had held strategy sessions for more consequential events than any other table on Earth, and which had, in the years of reduced occupancy, accumulated the particular quality of objects that have been important and are now in storage between purposes. Tony stood at the head of it with the manner of a man who has returned to something he left under complicated circumstances and has not yet determined what he feels about the return. He laid out the plan with characteristic precision, not performing the precision, not using it as armour against the emotional weight of the room, just thinking clearly and speaking clearly, which had always been the best version of Tony Stark and which appeared here in its purest form. 6 stones, 3 teams, converging on moments in the past where the stones were accessible, briefly, specifically within windows of time that required precision entry and extraction, without alerting the existing timeline to the presence of the future, that had arrived to borrow from it. Tony and Steve and Scott would travel to New York in 2012, during the Battle of New York, when 3 stones were momentarily in proximity: the Space Stone inside the Tesseract, the Mind Stone inside Loki's scepter, and the Time Stone held by the Ancient One at the Sanctum Sanctorum on Bleecker Street. Thor and Rocket would go to Asgard in 2013, in the period when Jane Foster had been infected by the Reality Stone, the ether, and the stone could be extracted from her without her awareness or harm. Natasha and Clint would travel to Vormir in 2014 to retrieve the Soul Stone, whose requirements had already been communicated to the group by those who'd been there before. Nebula and War Machine would also travel to 2014 to Morag to retrieve the Power Stone before Thanos' forces assembled around it. The suits Tony designed for the transit were white and streamlined, each one calibrated to the individual wearing it, carrying the transit coordinates embedded in its architecture, designed to interface with the quantum tunnel's field and deposit the wearer at the correct temporal coordinates with a margin of error that Tony considered acceptable and that anyone else would have considered extraordinary. They looked, suited up together in the loading bay, like something between a sports team and a physics experiment, which was probably accurate as a description of what they were. Steve looked at the assembled group for a long moment before the briefing concluded. These were his people, in the sense that the word contains all its implications. People he had chosen, and people who had chosen him, and people he had failed, and people who had failed him, and people whose love he carried in his body alongside their loss. He did not give a speech. Some moments do not need speeches. Some moments need only the acknowledgement that they are real. In the quantum tunnel, time is not a line. This is the most important thing to understand about what came next, and understanding it is a matter of feeling rather than analysis. Let the image arrive in your body rather than your mind, the way the most important things always arrive. Time is not a line. It is more like a landscape, something you can move through in more than one direction if you know the geometry of it and have the equipment appropriate to the terrain. The team entered the quantum space in the compound and emerged in 2012 New York with the particular disorientation of people who have moved sideways through reality rather than forward through it. Everything around them was simultaneously familiar and wrong, the familiar wrongness of a dream that takes place in a version of a place you know, where everything is recognizable and nothing is quite right. New York in 2012 was in the middle of its worst day. The sky above Midtown was the specific shade of apocalyptic purple that Tony remembered from the inside. The Chitauri pouring through the portal above Stark Tower. The Leviathans moving through the canyons of buildings with the indifferent enormity of machines built at a scale that exists to communicate the irrelevance of anything smaller. On the street level, people were running, and among them, in the chaos, the 2012 Avengers were working in the urgent, disorganized way of a team that had not yet finished becoming one. Tony Stark in the 2023 white time suit watched Tony Stark in the 2012 Iron Man armor flying overhead and had the strange doubling experience of observing his own history as if it belonged to someone else, which it did and didn't, in the way that all of our pasts both belong to us and have become someone we no longer are. Scott's task was the Mind Stone in Loki's scepter, which would be briefly accessible in the lobby of Stark Tower, before being claimed by SHIELD agents in the post-battle processing. The complication was the 2012 Hulk, who was in the stairwell, who was not happy, who made the narrow space of the stairwell substantially more difficult to navigate than the architectural plans would have suggested. and who had the singular quality of a being whose emotional state is both completely sincere and completely unsuited to the requirements of the immediate situation. Scott navigated around this with a combination of speed and the specific kind of luck that attends people who are operating with genuine focus in chaotic environments, and secured the scepter. This was the part of the plan that worked as designed. It was not the only part. The Space Stone, the Tesseract, was in the custody of SHIELD agents, processing the aftermath of the battle, being transferred in a briefcase from the building. Tony's plan for its retrieval was elegant and should have been straightforward. It was not straightforward. The 2012 Tony, being thrown by the 2012 Hulk, through a glass partition at a moment of precise tactical relevance, collided with the briefcase. The briefcase opened. The Tesseract slid across the floor. Loki, the 2012 Loki, the one who had not yet been through the years of consequence that would eventually change him into someone his 2023 self would not entirely recognize, was standing in the right place at the wrong time, and picked it up and looked at it with the expression of someone who has just been handed a gift they had stopped expecting, and disappeared. The plan required immediate revision. Fortunately, improvisation under pressure had always been Tony Stark's most reliable skill. The Battle of New York in 2012 had the quality of a historical event that the people now moving through it had processed and categorized and filed in the portion of memory reserved for formative experiences. They had lived it. They had been changed by it. It had been the first of the large-scale tests, the first time the category of threat that Thanos would eventually represent had shown itself at a scale that required a team response rather than an individual one, and the team had performed it in the specific improvisational way of a group of people who have just discovered each other and are finding out what they are capable of together by doing it for the first time in a context where failure would be catastrophic. From inside 2012, the people moving through the battle in white time suits had the peculiar advantage of knowing how the battle ended, which is a form of calm that the 2012 participants did not have, and which allowed them to move through the chaos with a different kind of focus. Not the focus of people fighting to determine the outcome, but the focus of people navigating a known environment toward a specific objective, while the environment goes about the business of being itself. What Steve Rogers felt moving through the corridors of Stark Tower in 2012 was a kind of grief he had not anticipated, and which arrived without announcement. Not grief for the people he saw. They were fine, or would be fine, or at least would be fine until much later when nothing was fine. But grief for the version of himself that was somewhere in the building, wearing the same face with a different set of years on it, carrying the same certainty and the same willingness and the belief, still intact in 2012, that if you did the work and were present and did not stop, things had a tendency to come out in a direction that justified the effort. The 2023 Steve knew things the 2012 Steve did not know about how complicated that tended to be, how frequently the direction was not what had been intended, how the effort sometimes came out in a direction that justified nothing except the decision to try again. He had not stopped trying, but the believing had changed its character, and seeing the version that believed simply and wholly was like seeing himself across a distance he could not close. The encounter between the two versions of Steve Rogers, in the corridor, the past Steve assessing the future Steve with the suspicious efficiency of a man trained to assess threats quickly and act before they can develop, lasted less than 3 minutes. The future Steve won it with a single phrase that cut directly through the 2012 Steve's defenses, because it spoke directly to a truth the 2012 Steve carried so completely that it could be used as a key. Hail Hydra. The phrase was a lie that the 2023 Steve deployed against the 2012 Steve's trust in institutional authority, his faith that the chain of command was populated by people operating in good faith. The 2012 Steve stood down. The 2023 Steve walked away. The emotional cost of the exchange was not visible in how he walked, because he had never allowed what it cost him to be visible in how he walked, but it was real, and it went with him into the corridor and toward the next thing. Scott's relationship with the chaos of the 2012 battle was, in retrospect, probably the element of the plan that Tony's precise engineering had least thoroughly accounted for, not because Scott was unreliable, but because chaos of that specific and multi-directional variety resist precise accounting regardless of how much intelligence is applied to modelling it in advance. The 2012 Hulk had not been in the briefing because the 2012 Hulk was operating on entirely different priorities and in an entirely different psychological configuration from the Bruce Banner who had participated in the planning in 2023. The 2012 Hulk was not briefed. The 2012 Hulk did not know about the time heist. What the 2012 Hulk did in that stairwell was therefore a significant unmodelled variable, and Scott Lang, to his considerable credit, navigated around it with the specific combination of speed and luck and genuine focus that attends people who are doing the thing they're doing with complete commitment. Breathe out slowly, all the way out, past where you think empty is, because there is always a little more room to release, always a little more air left to give back to the room. Let the last of it leave your lungs with the same unhurried pace that darkness leaves before dawn, not in a single moment but by degrees, the night thinning at its edges before it fully goes. You are very comfortable now. The weight in your body is not the weight of burden. It is the weight of rest, the weight of a body that has remembered it does not need to hold itself up anymore, that the floor or the mattress will do that work while the body does the work of healing and integrating and gradually sliding across the border into sleep. The story is still here. It is not going anywhere. It has nothing to do tonight but accompany you the rest of the way down. The loss of the Tesseract in 2012 required Tony and Steve to go further back. Not by decades, only by 8 years, to 1970, to the military installation in New Jersey, where SHIELD had maintained secure possession of the Tesseract since recovering it from the ocean after the war. Camp Lehigh. The base where Steve Rogers had trained before a serum and a Vita Ray chamber turned him into something the Sentry had decided to call a symbol, the place where Howard Stark had worked in the years when the Tesseract was a scientific mystery rather than a geopolitical fact. Tony and Steve stepped through a transit point in 2012 and emerged in 1970 with a disorientation that had a different quality from the 2012 arrival. Not just the disorientation of displaced time, but the specific vertigo of a world that predates you, a world in which you do not yet exist, in which the people you love and have lost and carry with you, as the entire architecture of your interior life, are young and uncertain and moving through their days without any knowledge of what is coming. Tony went to the secure storage wing of the base where the Tesseract was held. He acquired appropriate credentials from an inattentive supply officer and moved through the building with the specific confidence of a man who has decided that behaving as if he belongs somewhere is the most reliable method of belonging there, a principle he had practiced since his early 20s in context considerably less strange than this one. He found the Tesseract. He secured it. He was moving toward the exit when he encountered Howard Stark in a corridor. His father, 40 years before Tony's birth, a man his age, or close to it, which is the vertigo that is available to you only if you live long enough to understand that your parents were once the age you are now and were moving through that age without the map you have inherited from watching them. He did not tell Howard who he was. He introduced himself under a different name, and they walked together briefly in the corridor and spoke. Because Tony Stark cannot have a conversation with an interesting person without engaging with it fully. And Howard Stark was an interesting person, had always been an interesting person, under the distance and the difficulty and the specific failure of emotional vocabulary that had characterized the version of Howard that Tony had grown up knowing. The Howard in this corridor was younger than the Howard of Tony's memory. He was carrying less of the weight of what came later. He spoke about fatherhood with the careful hopefulness of someone who does not yet know how he will do at the thing he is attempting, who has found that the anticipation of a child produces in him both excitement and a very specific kind of fear, the fear of not being sufficient for the love the child will need. What Tony heard was not revelation. He had known, in the intellectual sense, the things Howard said in that corridor, that his father had loved him in the vocabulary available to him, that the vocabulary had been limited, that the limitation was not the same as the absence of feeling. He had known this as a conclusion reached through adult analysis and the long perspective of years. What the corridor in 1970 gave him was not the conclusion, but the evidence. Howard's voice carrying the feeling directly, without the filtering that years and distance and the complications of the actual relationship had imposed. He heard his father afraid of failing him before he had even arrived. He heard his father hoping. The hearing landed differently than the knowing had. He reached out and adjusted the scarf around his father's neck, the kind of gesture that says, "I know you, I was here, I forgive us both for everything that came between us." Howard did not understand the gesture. He accepted it with the mild surprise of someone receiving unexpected warmth. They parted ways in the corridor. Tony did not look back. Steve had his own encounter with the past at Camp La High, and his was silent rather than conversational, which is the kind his nature is better suited to anyway. He moved through the base on a separate trajectory, covering the operational necessities of the mission, and past a room where the door was slightly ajar, and through the gap he could hear, unmistakably and without any possibility of misidentification, the voice of Peggy Carter. Not recorded, not remembered, present, alive in 1970, in a room 10 feet from where he was standing, this same voice that had spoken to him across a radio connection in the moment before the plane went into the ice, the same voice that had said his name in a hospital room many decades later, with the full weight of everything they had not said to each other in the years between. He stood outside the door. He did not knock. He stood there for a duration that was neither brief nor long, something the body measures differently than the clock does, a moment that contained the full weight of a life's worth of unspent time and chose to leave it unspent. He walked away from the door. He continued with the mission. This is perhaps the most quietly remarkable act in the entire story, though it does not announce itself as one. Steve Rogers walked away from the thing he wanted most, in the specific moment when it was closest, because the work of the present required it, and because he had made a decision about what mattered and that decision held. He would revisit it, later, in a way the story has not yet arrived at, in the fullness of everything that came after. But in 1970, in a corridor, he walked away. Let your breath move through that slowly. Let the weight of it be what it is. Choosing the harder thing is always just that. Choosing it, one moment at a time, without certainty that the choice is right, without any guarantee except the integrity of the choosing. The most consequential exchange of the New York operation happened not between Tony and his father, and not in the corridor outside the door in 1970. It happened on a rooftop in 2012, between Bruce Banner and the Ancient One, a sorceress who had been the guardian of the Time Stone for longer than the institutions of the present had existed, and who had agreed to give it up only once before, and only to someone who had earned the specific quality of trust she reserved for the most difficult decisions. She appeared to Bruce on the rooftop not as an obstacle but as a teacher, which was how she appeared to most people when she chose to appear at all. She told him about the branches of the timeline, how removing a stone creates a fracture in the flow of reality, a branch where the stone's absence from history produces consequences she could not model in advance. She told him that Stephen Strange had given up the Time Stone willingly, once, in the future that had produced the present she was standing in, and that the reason he had done so was something she trusted without needing to understand. She placed the stone in Bruce's hand. He carried it with the care of someone who understands the difference between holding something valuable and holding something irreplaceable. The 1970 version of Camp Lehigh had the smell of military installations in that era, a combination of machine oil and institutional cleaning products, and the particular quality of air that moves through buildings designed to accommodate large numbers of people who are largely absent, the HVAC systems cycling through spaces that are only intermittently fully occupied. Tony moved through it with the specific confidence of a man who has learned that confidence is itself a credential in most institutional environments, that if you move purposefully and look like you know where you're going, the institutional immune system tends to assume you have been authorized to go there. He had borrowed a lab coat from a supply closet. He had acquired credentials from an unattended desk. He moved through the corridors of a military base in 1970 with the relaxed ease of someone for whom the present moment is simply the current problem to be solved, and the present moment cooperated. The conversation in the corridor between Tony and Howard Stark was brief, in the way that the most important conversations are often brief, not because the content was simple, but because the content exceeded what extended conversation could contain, and the excess lived in the quality of the moment rather than in the words it was possible to say. Howard spoke about the child he was expecting with a specific kind of careful hope. The hope of someone who is aware of his own limitations and who is hoping that the limitations will not be determinative, that the love he feels in the anticipation will be sufficient to compensate for the deficiencies he can already see in himself as a potential parent. He was not performing this. He was not presenting it to an audience. He was saying it to a stranger in a corridor, which was perhaps the only way he knew how to say the things he could not organize himself to say to the people who most needed to hear them. Tony listened. He had not expected to be moved. He was moved. They left 1970 the same way they had arrived, through the quantum transit, the field of the compound's loading bay receiving them with the specific anticlimax of all arrivals from non-linear time, the now reassembling itself around them with the indifferent efficiency of a present that has not been waiting for them, that has simply continued at its own pace. They had the Tesseract. They had the Mind Stone from earlier in the timeline. 2 stones secured. Tony and Steve stood in the loading bay of the compound and had a moment of adjustment, the specific adjustment of people who have just been to 1970 and are now in 2023 and need to let the 2 temporal locations settle into their appropriate relationship with each other, the past behind and the present immediate and the future, for the first time in 5 years, actually containing something. They did not discuss this. They went to find the others. The rooftop where Bruce met the Ancient One was quiet above the battle, in the specific way that high places in cities are quiet when the noise is happening below. Not silent, because the sounds of the conflict were audible as a general texture, but removed from it, occupying a register above the immediate and therefore slightly outside it. The Ancient One had known he was coming. She had prepared what she needed to say to him. The conversation was brief and complete in the way of conversations conducted by people who know they do not have long, and who have chosen in advance what the conversation is for. She told him about the branches of the timeline. She told him that Strange had given up the stone willingly, and that she trusted the reasons for it without needing to know the reasons. She placed the stone in his hands. He took it with both hands, which was not something the protocol of their interaction required, but which was the most honest available expression of the weight of what he was receiving. "You're so much further down now than when you began. The part of your mind that monitors and manages and keeps the list of everything that still needs doing has grown very quiet. Not gone, only resting, the way a fire banks down in the late hours of the night into something that holds warmth, without demanding attention, without requiring maintenance. Your breathing is very slow. Your body has the quality of something that has set itself down and does not intend to pick itself back up for a long time, and that decision is entirely correct and requires nothing more from you. The voice is still here. The story has a little further to go. Let it come to you rather than reaching for it. That is the only mode available now, and it is the right one. Asgard in 2013 was a kingdom moving through grief in the way that kingdoms move through grief, which is to say publicly and with ceremony, and with the particular kind of dignity that is both genuine and performed simultaneously. Because royalty does not have the luxury of grief without audience. Frigga had died, killed in the prison break that Loki had enabled and which Thor would spend years negotiating a complicated emotional accounting for, and the loss was still close enough to be immediate rather than historical. The golden halls were the same, the light was the same, but the quality of the air in the corridors was different, in the way that a room is different when the person who most animated it is no longer in it, when the life that gave the space its particular texture has been removed, and the space has not yet learned to hold its shape without that person inside it. Thor and Rocket arrived in 2013 Asgard with the specific task: extract the reality stone, the ether, from Jane Foster, who was carrying it as the consequence of an encounter with an ancient dimensional convergence that she had not chosen and could not fully understand, and who needed to be separated from it without harm, without awareness, and without any disturbance to the surrounding timeline. Rocket took the lead on the extraction, because Rocket is precisely suited to tasks that combine technical precision with the ethical flexibility of someone who has decided that the end objective overrides the protocol overhead. He moved through the palace with the specific quality of a person who does not actually belong in a space, but who moves through it with such purposeful confidence that the space's normal processes simply redirect around him rather than flagging his presence. He extracted the ether. The stone was secured. But Thor had found his mother. He had moved through the palace corridors with the operational discipline of someone completing a mission and the emotional coherence of someone walking through a dream they know is a dream, and the dream was Asgard in the year before everything fell apart. The year when his mother was still alive and the kingdom was still whole, and the version of him that lived here was still operating in the comfortable assumption that the future would more or less resemble the past. He found Frigga in one of the palace's interior corridors, occupied with the patient domestic business of a queen who is also a sorceress, and who holds both roles with the same unsentimental competence. She looked at him. She knew immediately that something was wrong. Not simply wrong in the situational sense. Not that he'd received bad news or made a mistake or found himself in an unfamiliar difficulty. Wrong in the deeper sense of a person who's been changed by something beyond the ordinary catalogue of change. She did not ask him to explain. She had never required her son to produce complete explanations before she would engage with his need. She asked him what he needed from her, and then she listened with the complete attention that was one of Frigga's defining qualities, the attention of a person who understands that most conversations are really about something other than their stated subject, and who is willing to go to the actual subject without requiring the other person to articulate the root. What Thor needed, underneath everything he tried to say about failure and inadequacy, and the specific gap between the man he had been and the man the situation had required, was the thing that had been taken from him in the years since her death, the experience of being known by someone who loved him without condition or agenda. She gave him that. She gave it to him in the specific way she had always given it, which was not through reassurance or encouragement in the conventional sense, but through the clear, direct look of a person who sees you completely and finds nothing in what they see that changes their orientation toward you. She told him that the future was not the past arranged differently, that whatever he was coming from, and she understood from the quality of his face that it was something large and final and hard, was his now, the same way all of his past was his, not as burden, but as material. That the question was not what had been lost, but what was being built from the loss, and that the answer to that question was not something she could give him, but something she could see the beginning of in the way he was standing, in the way he'd come to find her, in the fact that finding her had been the first thing he had reached for when the operational requirement of the mission had allowed him a moment of reach. He called Mjolnir. The hammer came. It came with the same immediacy it had always come. The vibration in the air, the rightness of its weight in his palm, the sensation of something that belongs to you returning after an absence you had incorrectly understood as permanent. His eyes filled. He let them. That too was something his mother had always permitted. Vormir. The name carries a quality of finality in this story's vocabulary that none of the other locations in it quite match. Vormir is a planet at the centre of a dead solar system. The sun is still there, in the technical sense that a star that has burned through its available fuel and collapsed into its own gravity is still technically a sun. But the light it gives is minimal and cold, and does not carry the warmth that living light carries, does not land on surfaces the way light from a functioning star lands. The stone of the cliffs is the colour of something that was once different. The air is cold without being clean. The whole place has the quality of a location that exists for a purpose that does not include the comfort of those who arrive in it. Natasha and Clint arrived there together in 2014, before Thanos' own visit to this same location would make it historically significant in the way that only catastrophes make things historically significant. The Guardian of the Soul Stone explained its cost. He has explained it the same way to everyone who has come to this place, in all the iterations of this story that contain a visit here. With the patience of someone for whom repetition is not tedious, because the stakes have always been identical. The Soul Stone cannot be seized. It cannot be negotiated for. It cannot be earned through valour or intelligence or persistence or any of the standard currencies through which the other stones have been claimed. It requires a sacrifice, the thing you love most, given without reservation, lost completely. Not given in the sense of offered, given in the sense of gone. Natasha and Clint stood at the edge of the cliff and looked at each other, and each of them knew immediately and completely what the other was thinking, and what they were both thinking was, "It should be me." They argued on the edge of the cliff the way two people argue when they both mean it completely, and neither of them will yield, with the full force of a sincere belief that their own life was the appropriate price and that the other's life was a thing the world still needed. She went over the edge. He caught her. She looked at him from the end of the rope and let go. Clint knelt at the bottom of the cliff in the thin, cold light and held the soul stone and stayed there for a long moment before he could make himself stand up. He stood up. The stone was warm. The argument at Vormir's edge had the quality of all arguments conducted between two people who both mean what they are saying completely, which is to say it was absolutely sincere and completely irresolvable by the usual methods, because the usual methods assume that one party will eventually be persuaded by the evidence or the logic, and neither Natasha nor Clint had a logical framework that produced the answer they each wanted. They had known each other for a very long time. They had been in the category of people who are permitted to tell each other the full truth, which is a smaller category than friendship, and which requires a specific and accumulated history of having done exactly that without the relationship breaking under the weight of it. He told her the full truth, that she had a life worth coming back to, that the world needed what she was, that the people who remained in the compound needed what she knew how to do. She told him the full truth back, that his children needed their father, that she had made her peace, that she was not afraid, and that the one thing she was not willing to do was watch him be the one who went over the edge. She moved first because she decided before the argument began. His hand caught the rope. Her eyes found his from the other end of it. Then she let go, and he was left on the cliff in the thin, cold light of a dead solar system, with a soul stone in his hand and a grief in his chest that would not name itself for a very long time. He stayed on the cliff for a while before he stood up. There is no precise record of how long. In the accounting of the timeline it was a brief duration, measured in the small units that missions use to measure pauses in the field. In the accounting of a human being sitting in the specific cold of Vormir's atmosphere, having just watched the person who called him her best friend make the last choice she would make, the duration was not brief in any of the senses that matter. He sat with the stone in his hand and the full weight of the transaction, and then he stood up because sitting down was not available to him as a permanent option. And the standing up was one of the harder things he had ever done, and he did it. And he returned to the present, and the stone was warm in his hand for the entire transit home. The reality stone, the ether, had been one of the most difficult of the infinity stones to understand in the conventional sense, because it did not behave like a discrete object whose properties could be catalogued and predicted. It was less like a gem and more like a living fluid, seeking hosts and expressing itself through the biology of whatever carried it, bending the physical laws of its immediate environment towards some vision of a universe that no longer had to be constrained by the fixed rules of matter and energy. Jane Foster had not chosen to carry it. She had stumbled into the convergence that brought it to her, and it had entered her body in the way that forces much larger than the bodies that contain them tend to enter, not by invitation but by the simple fact of proximity and the path of least resistance. She had survived it longer than she should have. That survival was its own form of extraordinary, though it had not been comfortable, and the Asgardians who had been monitoring her condition had not been optimistic about the long-term prognosis. Rocket's extraction removed the problem. The reality stone contained in Tony's equipment was no longer her burden to carry. Let the images float now without needing to arrange them into sequence. Your mind is doing something softer than thinking. It is holding the story the way water holds a reflection, not grasping at it, not analysing it, only receiving it with the open quality of a surface that takes whatever light arrives and gives back something true. The heaviness in your body has deepened. Your chest rises and falls with the slow, wide regularity of someone who is already most of the way to sleep. If you are still following the words, that is fine. If you have crossed the border already and the words are coming to you from the other side of sleep, muffled and warm and not quite distinct, that is also fine. The voice will continue either way. It has nowhere else to be. They return to the present with the stones. The word returned is insufficient for what the transit involved. The quantum tunnel's compression and expansion, the quantum field releasing them into the compound's loading bay, with the disorientation of all exits from nonlinear space, the specific quality of returning to the present when you've been in the past and feel the weight of both on your body simultaneously. They came back, the space stone, the mind stone, the time stone, the reality stone, the power stone, the soul stone carried by Clint Barton in a hand that had not stopped shaking since Vormir, with the specific tremor of a body that has been through something it was not designed to be through and is still processing the dimensions of it. 6 stones, the original components of an act of destruction reassembled for the purpose of its reversal. Tony built the new gauntlet in the compound's workshop. He worked through the night, which was the pace he'd always worked at when the problem was important enough. The night being the time when the compound was quiet, and the available distractions reduced to nothing, and the problem expanded to fill the space that the distractions had vacated. He used Stark technology and Uru, the metal of Asgard which Thor had arranged to have available for exactly this purpose, understanding from his own experience of Nidavellir that some containment problems require materials not available on Earth. The Uru was necessary because the combined energy field of 6 active infinity stones exceeds the tolerance of any material in the human periodic table, and the gauntlet had to not simply hold the stones, but channel their combined output through the deliberate action of a human hand without destroying the hand, the arm, the person attached to it, and ideally the building they were standing in. The impossibility of this had been acknowledged and set aside. Impossibility in Tony Stark's operational framework is a category with a time limit. It means something cannot currently be done. Not that it cannot be done, and the interval between currently and eventually is the space in which he had spent his entire career. He had built things that could not be built. He had solved problems that had been classified as unsolvable. He had been wrong about his own limitations more times than he had been right about them, and the being wrong had always resolved in the direction of being able to do more than he had previously believed. He built the gauntlet. He tested the energy containment. He made the adjustments the testing revealed were necessary. By morning it was done, and it sat on the workshop table with the quality of a finished thing, not beautiful in the conventional sense, but complete, which is a different and more serious kind of beauty. Bruce held it for a long moment before putting it on. He stood in the compound's main space, the whole remaining team assembled, everyone who had gone to the past and come back, everyone who was still standing. And he looked at the gauntlet and then looked at the stones seated in their places in the iron, each one pulsing with the specific quality of its domain. He understood, in the scientific sense and in every other sense, what the next 30 seconds would cost him. The gamma radiation output of the combined stones during activation would be, by his own calculations, survivable for him in a way it would not be survivable for a normal human body. But survivable was a relative term, and the cost on the surviving side of it was real and physical, and would be with him for the rest of his life. He accepted this the way he had learned to accept the conditions of his existence, not gladly, not without awareness of what was being lost, but with the understanding that some situation present you with a specific set of options, and the best available option is still the one you choose. He put the gauntlet on. The stones responded immediately. They were not passive objects. They were, each of them, a fundamental force of existence concentrated into crystalline form, and in proximity to each other and to the hand that was attempting to wield them, they came alive in a way that was visible to everyone in the room, a light that was not quite light in the visual sense but was perceived by something deeper than sight. Bruce described the sensation afterward as having the sun inside his hand. The warmth, the pressure, the indiscriminate enormity of it, not painful yet, but present in the way that something is present when it exceeds the scale of your ability to contain it, when the thing being experienced is larger than the capacity of the organism experiencing it. He held his hand still. He thought about the people he was trying to return, specifically, individually, the specific people that 5 years of loss had made specific and real and irreplaceable. He curled his fingers. The snap was quiet. This is the thing that surprises people in retrospect, the thing that is hardest to reconcile with the scale of what it accomplished. The snap of a gauntleted hand in the loading bay of an upstate New York compound was not loud. It was the sound of one human action, amplified slightly by the uru of the gauntlet, not the sound of the universe rewriting itself, which apparently does not make the kind of sound you would expect. Then the arm. The damage travelled up the arm from the hand with the speed of something that had been waiting to happen, the gamma radiation leaving its evidence in the tissue as it went, and the pain of it was something Bruce Banner absorbed, in the specific way he had learned to absorb pain over the years of his life in this particular body, which is to say he absorbed it without disappearing behind it, without losing the capacity to stay present in the room. The test was not a readout. There were no instruments calibrated to measure whether the returned half of the universe had rematerialized in the locations and conditions and ages they had occupied before Thanos' original snap. The test was whether the birds returned, whether the sound changed, whether the specific texture of the world acquired the quality of a world that is complete, rather than a world with half its content missing, the way a room feels different when a person enters it, even before you have turned to see who it is. Clint's phone rang. He answered it. His wife's voice. He sat down on the floor of the loading bay, still in his tactical gear, and could not speak for a moment, could not form words around the fact of what he was hearing, could only listen with the full and terrible relief of someone who has returned from Vormir, carrying the price of what he had just received, the loss of one person in his hand and the return of everyone else in his ear. Then the floor began to shake, not from the stones, from something coming from outside. The convergence of the stones in the gauntlet was not a neutral event even before Bruce snapped his fingers. The 6 stones in proximity to each other had always had a quality of awareness, not consciousness in the human sense, not the quality of a mind that thinks and chooses, but something more fundamental than that. The awareness that exists at the level of physical law, the way gravity is aware of mass in the sense that it responds to it consistently and completely. The stones in proximity responded to the gauntlet and to each other with the specific intensity of forces that have found the context for their combined expression, and the room in which this happened had a quality that everyone present perceived differently, but that all of them perceived. A change in the pressure of the air, a change in the light, a sense of being in the presence of something that exceeded the normal categories of what was present in a room. The question of who would wear the gauntlet had not been a long discussion. It had been a short one because the parameters of the question were clear, and the answer fell out of the parameters with the directness of a solution, that is the only available option once the constraints are honestly stated. It needed to be someone who could survive the gamma radiation output of the combined stones, which was the dominant physiological constraint. It needed to be someone who could maintain the focused intention required to direct the snap's effects, rather than simply discharge the combined power in the direction of whatever was most immediate. It needed to be someone who understood, in the most complete available sense, what they were trying to restore, who could hold that understanding in the moment of activation with sufficient clarity and specificity that the stones could execute against it. Bruce satisfied all three requirements, and everyone in the room knew it, and he knew it too, and the knowing had the quality of acceptance rather than reluctance. The silence after the snap lasted for a specific and measurable duration that felt much longer than it was. In that silence, in the compound's loading bay with Bruce on the floor and the ruined arm and the gauntlet dimmed and inert, each person present was running their own internal calculation of what had just happened. They had done what they had come to do. They had returned from the past with the stones. They had assembled and activated the gauntlet. The question now was whether it had worked, whether the enormous and specific and irreversible thing that Bruce had done in the previous 30 seconds had produced the result that warranted it. The test was not available in the compound. The test was outside, in the world, in the places where the returned would be returning to. And then Clint's phone rang, and the test was over, and the compound began to shake. Bruce Banner has described what the activated gauntlet felt like from the inside, with the carefully chosen vocabulary of a scientist describing an experience that exceeds his available categories. The sun in his hand is one formulation. The sense of every nerve in his body being simultaneously overclocked and burned is another. What he does not usually say, because it is harder to say, is what it felt like in the intentional dimension rather than the physical one, the experience of directing something that large and that indifferent to the scale of the vessel carrying it. The stones were not passive. They had always been not passive, had always required the person wielding them to hold a clear and specific intention, and to hold it under the full pressure of the power moving through them without being swept out of the intention by the power itself. He held the intention. He held it with the specific focus of someone who has spent years learning to hold two things at once without being collapsed by the contradiction. He thought about the specific people he was trying to restore. He kept their faces in his mind. He snapped his fingers. The ruined arm would require years of recovery and would never fully return to its previous function, which Bruce accepted with the equanimity he had developed for all permanent changes to his body. He had been living with permanent changes to his body for long enough that the category had lost its power to frighten him. The arm was the price. The price was paid. The question was whether the payment had produced the result, and the question answered itself when Clint's phone rang in the rubble, and the voice on the other end of it was his wife saying his name. Your breath is very slow now, very slow and very deep, and even in the way that breathing becomes even when the body has moved past the threshold of effort and into the automatic, generous rhythm of genuine rest. If you're still holding tension anywhere, in your jaw, in the space between your shoulder blades, behind your eyes, let it go now, on this exhale, completely and without effort, the way you release a grip that has held too long. You have travelled very far in this story. The destination is very close. Let me take you through the last of it, the last and the hardest and the most important, and then the story will set you down gently, and the dark will receive you, and you will not need to carry anything further tonight. the 2014 Thanos arrived through a breach in the compound's hull that he had made by targeting its structural foundation from orbit, a method that did not require strategy or subtlety, and that communicated something important about the version of this person who was now descending. The Thanos who had made his original choice had been, in a terrible way, a man with a philosophy, a person who believed with complete sincerity in what he was doing, and who had been willing to experience the full weight of the transaction, including its cost to himself. The 2014 and Thanos had not yet been through the moment of having made the choice and having to live in the silence of the world the choice produced. He was the version before consequence, the version driven entirely by certainty, and certainty in a being of that scale and capability is the most dangerous available configuration. He had seen the future through the technological residue in Nebula's memory, had seen Bruce's snap reverse the 5 years of loss, and understood that the team in the compound had done what he had assumed could not be done. What they had done was change the outcome. What he intended to do was change the terms entirely. Not simply unreverse Bruce's snap, but unmake the conditions that had produced the resistance. Destroy what existed and rebuild from the beginning, a universe that would not remember what it had lost and therefore could not mourn it, could not organize itself against it, could not produce the specific kind of people who build time machines in upstate New York out of grief and mathematical precision, and the refusal to accept that the loss is permanent. The compound came apart around the people inside it with the specific completeness of something destroyed from above rather than within. The walls first, then the ceiling following the walls with the inevitability of physics completing a process already begun, the rubble displacing the water in the basement as the infrastructure that held the water containers separated from the infrastructure that had contained them. Tony and Steve and Thor surfaced from the wreckage through different paths, converging on what had been the loading bay and was now open sky, and they stood in the ruins with the specific quality of people who have just been through something that took less time than it takes to describe, and who are still calibrating what they have emerged into. They could see the ships. They could see the army. The three of them. The original configuration, the first of it. The three men who had stood in a field in Germany and taken a reading of each other and found the reading sufficient to build on, looked at what was in front of them and made the only decision available. What happened next is a thing that resists linear description because it did not happen linearly. It happened everywhere and simultaneously, and in the specific chaos that characterizes large-scale confrontations between forces that include people who can do things that change the physical conditions of the surrounding environment. The portals opened above the ruins. Stranger's work coordinated with the other masters of the mystic arts and with everyone who had been reached by the returning restored, the snap's reversal sending its signal outward into every corner of the world and every corner of the galaxy, where people who had been lost were suddenly and completely returned. Through the portals came everyone, Wakanda's forces with T'Challa at their head, moving with the composed efficiency of an army that has fought larger battles than this and won. The Asgardians from Norway, the Sorcerers, the Guardians, and through one specific portal, in a trajectory that was less tactical approach and more controlled enthusiasm, Peter Parker, who had woken from 5 years of not existing into the middle of a war, and who was not going to spend any time at all standing at the edges of it. He found Tony in the chaos and said his name and held on. Tony held him back, both arms in the suit, in the middle of the ruins of the worst day, with the completeness of someone holding something they had been certain was gone. The moment was brief because the battle was still happening, and the battle was the kind that did not allow for extended pauses. But it was real, and the realness of it was the most important fact in the field at that moment, more important than the numbers or the physics or the outcome still being determined in the surrounding chaos. Tony filed it. He had always been good at filing the things that mattered in the moment when they arrived, storing them in the place where the things that justified everything else lived. Wanda Maximoff moved through Thanos' forces with a grief that had been transformed by 5 years, and by the specificity of her loss, Vision, and the particular way Vision had been lost, and the years since the loss, into something that was both grief and its transcendence, a power that had the quality of fire, of water, of the specific and irreversible force that loss produces in people who do not allow it to become passivity. She was not fighting to win. She was fighting to express something that the available vocabulary of the world did not contain, that required physical expression because no other kind was sufficient. Thanos encountered this and was, for one of the only times in his history, uncertain. She was capable of things that exceeded his immediate capacity to counter, and the certainty that had been his primary weapon against everyone he had faced since his design had crystallized into its final form, showed, in those moments against Wanda, the first evidence of its limit. He had the gauntlet again. He had taken it from the rubble with the focused purpose of someone who has always believed that possession of the instrument is possession of the outcome. He raised his hand. He was going to do more than resnap. He was going to unmake what existed and begin the new universe without the burden of what this one remembered, without the problem of people who built time machines out of grief. In the moment before his fingers closed, Tony Stark reached for him. The nanotechnology in Tony's suit extended filaments that he'd designed and prepared for exactly this contingency, not the fight, which he'd known would happen and which he had prepared for separately, but this. The possibility of the stones being within reach, within the distance that the suit's own nano-architecture could span. The stones transferred, from the gauntlet to Tony's arm, pressing through the suit's metal and into the biology beneath, with the specific and immediate cost of 6 fundamental forces passing through a human body that was not designed to contain them. His arm began to fail at once. He looked at Thanos. He said, "I am Iron Man." He closed his own fist. Thanos and his armies dissolved in the specific way that things dissolve when the force that assembled them is reversed, not destroyed, not erased, only returned to the state before the assembling. The field was quiet. Tony Stark sat down. Pepper came to him. She said, "We're going to be okay." He heard her. He held her voice in the specific place where he kept the things that were worth everything. Then his eyes closed, and the lake was very still, and the morning was very clear, and it was enough. The portal above the ruined compound opened, and through it came T'Challa at the head of the Wakandan forces, the armies of the most technologically advanced nation on Earth, fully armed, moving through the golden circle of Stranger's portal, with the composed efficiency of a military that has drilled for situations of exactly this scale. Behind them came the Asgardians of New Asgard, smaller in number, but carrying the specific quality of people who have survived the destruction of their world once, and have decided that survival is something they are willing to fight for in perpetuity. Then the sorcerers, the guardians, the returned, the billions who had been dust for 5 years and were now simply here, in the specific and disorienting way that return is always disorienting, arriving in the middle of a battle they had not witnessed the beginning of, and understanding immediately the shape of what was required. Peter Parker came through one of the later portals moving fast, as Peter Parker always moved, as Peter Parker was constitutionally incapable of not moving, and found Tony in the chaos, and said his name and held on. Wanda Maximoff moved through Thanos' army with a grief concentrated into force. She had lost vision twice, once in Wakanda, when she'd made the most terrible choice available to her and destroyed the stone he carried to prevent Thanos from taking it, and once immediately after when Thanos reversed her choice with the Time Stone and took it anyway, undoing the sacrifice that had cost her everything, and making it cost her everything again in the space of 30 seconds. 5 years had not changed what those 30 seconds contained. They had concentrated it. She moved through the field with the full force of everything that 30 seconds had produced in her, and Thanos, who had been through everything and faced everyone, took a step back. The cost of wearing the stones was not something Tony had fully disclosed to the group in the weeks of planning that preceded the battle. He had disclosed the technical dimensions of it, the radiation exposure, the neural disruption, the structural damage to the biological tissue through which the stone's energy passed. He had not disclosed the dimension that sat underneath the technical, which was the simple fact that he had known, since the moment he ran the calculation on the night Scott Lang appeared at the lake, that the snap that restored the universe would need to be reversed by someone, and that the someone would need to be capable of surviving what the stones did to their carrier, and that Bruce was the only one who could survive it in the way that surviving meant living afterward. But if the original snap was available only to Bruce, the counter-snap against Thanos was different. It was available to whoever was closest to the stones in the moment when the stones were accessible, and Tony had been engineering for that proximity since the beginning. He had not told them this. He had not told Pepper this, which was the harder omission. He had told Morgan he loved her 3,000, and 3,000 is not a number with a fixed meaning but a child's mathematics, which is to say the most accurate kind. The field after the battle was quiet in the particular way of fields that have contained catastrophe, and have now returned to the condition of being fields. The grass there, the sky there, the sounds of the world recommencing around the perimeter of the thing that happened at its centre. People were moving through the ruins of the compound, helping each other, establishing positions, doing the necessary work of the aftermath. Tony was sitting on a piece of rubble with his back against a larger piece of rubble, and the suit fading from his body as its systems registered that the crisis requiring them had ended. Pepper was with him. She had come through one of the portals, Pepper Potts, who had not fought in the battle, but who was not going to let the battle end without her presence where it ended, who had walked through the golden circle in the armour Tony had built for her years ago when it had become clear that loving Tony Stark required occasional emergency access to battle-capable equipment. She sat beside him and held his hand. She told him they were going to be okay. It was the kindest possible lie and the most complete possible truth simultaneously. He closed his eyes in the field, and the lake was there, and it was still, and the morning light was on the water, and Morgan was on the dock, and it was enough. It was entirely enough. It was 3,000. You have travelled very far tonight, very far and very deep, through 5 years of silence and the cold quantum dark and the edge of a cliff in a dead solar system, and the field where everything was decided. Let all of it grow soft now. Let the images dissolve gently at their edges, the way photographs dissolve when the light changes, not vanishing, only fading into something softer than the original, held now in the body rather than the mind, where things live without requiring management. You do not need to hold any of this. The story has already held it. It will always have been held. Let the exhale carry the last of the tension, and let the next breath bring only quiet. There is nothing left tonight to carry. There is only the drift. There is only the dark, patient and complete, waiting to receive you. The funeral was on the lake. The cabin was behind the mourners, the same cabin where Tony had made his quiet life, where Morgan had learned to walk on the uneven boards of the dock and had decided that the dock was her territory and the lake was her subject. The water was flat and still, the way lakes are in the early morning before the wind has arrived to complicate the surface, before the day has begun its business of motion and reflection, and all the small disturbances that turn a mirror into something more like a record of everything that has passed through it. Pepper walked to the edge of the dock alone. She was carrying the arc reactor, the one from his chest, the one that had kept him alive since the cave in Afghanistan, the blue light of it gone dark now and the darkness of it more eloquent than any light could have been. She set it on the surface of the water. She let it go. It turned slowly as it drifted out, catching the morning light with the particular quality of things that were designed to glow and are now only reflecting, and then the distance made it difficult to see, and then the morning light absorbed it, and it was part of the lake. Peter Parker stood among the mourners with the specific quality of someone who is simultaneously too young for what is being asked of him, and entirely capable of meeting it. He had lost Tony before, or the version of losing that 5 years of dust had been, the not losing that was also not having, the absence that had the shape of loss without the confirmation of it. He had been returned to a world where Tony was alive long enough to hold him and say his name, and then he had watched the field, and now he was standing by a lake in the morning light, and the grief was the clean kind, the kind that has not yet accumulated the complicated layers that time adds to it. He would carry this, the way he carried all of it. He had always been built for carrying. Steve Rogers did not stay. This was known by those who knew him before he said anything. He had the quality of someone who has been somewhere long enough to know what comes next, the particular stillness of a person at the end of a chapter who understands that the next chapter is in a different book. He made his goodbyes with the quiet of a person who has learned, through long practice, that goodbyes are better when they are not theatrical, when the weight of the ending is acknowledged rather than performed. He went to the quantum tunnel for the last time, with coordinates in his suit, and a destination that only he had chosen, in the way that some choices belong only to the person making them. He went back, to the dance, to the room where the promise had been made across a radio frequency in the moments before the plane went into the ice. He went back to the life that the ice had interrupted. He lived it. He was old when he came back, his face carrying the specific evidence of a life that had been long and full, and chosen in the most complete sense of the word chosen. He gave the shield to Sam Wilson, which is a kind of sentence and a kind of inheritance and a kind of love, all three simultaneously compressed into a single gesture. Sam understood what the shield meant and what it would ask of him, and what it would not give him in exchange for what it asked, and he took it with the seriousness it deserved. The shield continued. The story the shield told about what it meant to stand for something continued. It was not the same story it had been. The world had changed too much for anything to be exactly what it had been. But it was a true story, the kind that updates itself with the times without abandoning the truths it was built on. Sam carried it forward. The rest is another story. Thor left for space with people he would not have predicted, in directions he could not have charted from where he'd been 2 weeks before. The Guardians of the Galaxy received him with the particular quality of welcome that the Guardians bring to everything, which is to say with chaos and warmth, and the complete absence of protocol, and he moved into the life of the stars with the specific lightness of someone who has finally put down a weight they had been carrying since before they understood it was heavy. He was not a king anymore. He was not a symbol anymore. He was going to find out what he was in the wide and patient space of everything that was not Earth, with people who had no preconceptions about what he was supposed to be. The stars received him. They always had. He had been made of the same material. Peter Parker went back to school. He had been gone for 5 years and was the same age as when he left, which put him in the specific position of someone navigating a present that has moved without him. Classmates who had graduated, teachers who had retired, a version of his own life that had continued along a timeline he had not been present for. He sat in the window of his room and looked at New York, which was all the things it had always been, and more of them. The city continuing its project of being too much and not enough, and entirely itself at all times. He thought about Tony. He thought about Natasha, who had not come back and whose absence had a shape that the returned world had to arrange itself around. He thought about May, who had been there when he returned, who had held him in the middle of a hallway in a school that had become a shelter and had not let go for a long time. He would be all right. He was always going to be all right. That was not optimism. It was the most accurate assessment available of someone made the way he was made. And now, let the story rest here. In the quiet after everything, in the specific quality of quiet that follows a long and honest telling, the quiet that is not empty but full, the way a room feels full after the people who filled it have gone home, their warmth still in the air, their presence still in the arrangement of the chairs. There is space in you now that was not there when you began tonight. Not because the story has added something, but because it has opened something, the way a long exhale opens the lungs to the breath that follows it, larger and cleaner than the one before. Breathe into that space now. Let it expand. Let the warmth of it travel all the way down your spine and into your hands and out to the tips of your fingers and the soles of your feet. You are held. You are safe. The night is doing its work of rest and repair, and you only have to let it. Tony Stark's arc reactor is somewhere on the lake now, carried by the current into whatever part of the water keeps for itself. The lake does not mourn it. The lake holds everything that comes to it with the same steady, impersonal patience. The morning mist and the afternoon light, and the small boats that row out on the good days, and the rain that falls on the bad ones. It holds the arc reactor the way it holds all the rest. It holds you too, in whatever form a story can hold the person who has listened to it. Not tightly, not with any demand, only in the way that water holds the shape of everything that passes through it. Let it hold you now. Let the last of the story settle into the deep part of you where things rest when they do not need to be carried. Morgan Stark grew up by that lake. She knew its moods and its seasonal changes and the names of the birds that nested in the reeds at its edge. She grew up knowing that her father had loved her more than any calculation he had ever made, and that the calculation he had made at the end had been made because he loved her, not in spite of it. Rest there, in the love that was larger than the loss, in the quiet of a lake on a morning when the surface is still and the light is just arriving, and there is nowhere to be but here, in the warm, receiving dark of everything that is already, finally, at rest. Sleep well. You have earned it. If you liked this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I am always curious about that, and if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments below. The days that followed the battle had the quality of aftermath that does not announce itself as aftermath. The days that look, from the outside, like the beginning of recovery and which are, from the inside, still entirely inside the event, still processing dimensions of it that will take months and years to fully surface. The world was fuller than it had been the day before. The returned were navigating the specific disorientation of a 5-year gap, 5 years in which their families had changed, their neighbourhoods had changed, their relationships had developed or ended or transformed in ways they had not been present to witness. The world had kept moving without them, and the world did not stop to explain what it had done in their absence. They had to piece it together from what they found, the way you piece together what happened at a party you left early by looking at the evidence the morning after. Morgan Stark grew up by the lake. This is a fact about the future that the story does not follow into, but that it implies in the specific way that stories imply futures that are not their subject, through the quality of the present moment, through what the present contains, through the sense of something beginning that has not yet declared what it is beginning into. She grew up knowing the lake's seasons and the birds that move through its reed beds and the specific quality of light that the water produced in the early morning when the mist was on it. She grew up with her father's absence as the permanent condition of the presence she had known, which is the kind of loss that children carry differently from adults, not as the subtraction of something that was there, because she had been 3, because the presence had not been long enough to become her baseline, but as the knowledge of something that existed and was hers and was not available. She carried it the way he had carried everything. Forward. The lake is still there. It holds the same light it held on the morning of the funeral, the same quality of stillness before the wind arrives to complicate the surface. The arc reactor is somewhere on its floor, carried down by the weight of its materials through the water column over the years since Pepper set it on the surface and let it go. It is resting on the bottom in the cold and the dark where the lake keeps the things it receives. The lake does not distinguish between the things it holds, the early morning light and the late afternoon reflection, and the rain that falls on the bad days and the arc reactor on the floor of it, are held with the same patient impersonality, the same complete and unconditional receiving. That is what the dark is doing for you tonight, receiving you, holding you without requiring anything of you, letting you rest in the specific way that things rest when they have been set down with care and are not required to be useful for a while. You've done enough, you are enough. Let go.